What do you do when the man who kidnapped you is the only person left in the world who can save you? What happens when the walls you are Eurostrayed re-trapped behind are the only sanctuary you have left? For Emil, this wasn't a hypothetical question. It was the terrifying reality pounding on his door. A sharp, insistent knock echoed through the tiny refuge, a sound that sliced through the feverish haze of his heat. One rap, two, three, the air, which moments before had been thick with tension and a desire so potent it was almost a physical thing, instantly turned to ice. Everything vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling alertness that sobered him more than any cold water ever could. Lucar Eurostrade's hand, in a movement so fluid it was almost invisible, was already on the weapon at his side. He moved to the hidden peephole, his entire body a coiled spring of lethal intent, his face a grim mask of stone. He peered through the distorted glass of Euros and every ounce of color drained from his face. A voice, smooth as polished glass and just as cold, filtered through the thick wood of the door. Lucar Edivane, open this door. I have na Eurostrade to come here to negotiate. Ir Eurostrade v come to claim what is legally mine. The words, when are Eurostrade to a request. They were a declaration of ownership, and they were aimed directly at Emil. This is the story of how Emil found himself in that impossible moment, caught between a captor who refused to claim him and a predator who believed he already owned him. But to understand the choice he was about to face, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the moment his gilded cage was broken, only to be replaced by another. It began with the suffocating darkness of a hood pulled tight over his face. The fight had drained out of him hours ago, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost a surrender. His hands, bound so tightly behind his back, had long since stopped bleeding from their struggle against the restraints, now just a numb, useless weight. His legs, after an eternity spent being jostled in a vehicle winding through what felt like endless mountain passes, were barely responsive. He had no concept of where he was, only a chaotic collage of sensations. The air that seeped through the rough fabric of the hood was thick with a scent of damp earth, ancient wood, and the faint, metallic tang of rust. But layered over it all, dominating every other smell, was the scent of an unknown alpha. It was a powerful, untamed fragrance, like a wild forest after a thunderstorm or Euros full of ozone, wet leaves, and raw, unrestrained power. And it was laced with something else, a chilling undercurrent of cold, calculated fury that bordered on madness. He was half dragged, half carried from the vehicle, his feet stumbling over loose gravel. The sound of a heavy door groaning open, a protest of old hinges that sounded like a dying beast, cut through the night. Then a voice, low and gravelly, a sound like stones grinding together, issued a final command. Leave him with me. I will handle this from here. The crunch of heavy boots on the gravel faded into the distance, leaving Emil in a terrifying silence. He felt himself shoved unceremoniously into a chair, the rough wood digging into his back. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of his own breathing. Then he heard them. Footsteps. They weren't hurried or anxious, they were slow, deliberate, each one a pronouncement of absolute control. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. The air crackled with a silent, predatory energy. And then, the voice spoke again, closer this time, a low rumble that vibrated through Emil Eurostrade's very bones. So, this is him, the prized son of that bastard Morty. The hood was ripped from his head with a single, rough motion. Light, dim as it was, stabbed at his eyes. It filtered through a small, dust-caked window, and after the prolonged darkness, it felt like a physical blow. He blinked rapidly, his vision swimming, trying to focus on the figure looming over him. And then he saw him. The Alpha standing before him was young, perhaps in his late 20s, but his eyes held the weight of centuries. They were like chips of obsidian, hard and ancient and utterly devoid of warmth, set in a face of sharp angles and high cheekbones. A jagged scar, a stark white line against sun-weathered skin, cut a path through his left eyebrow, a permanent mark of some past violence. His sheer presence was overwhelming, filling the small cabin, an aura of contained power that seemed to expand with every silent second he stared down at Emil. This was the kind of man who didn't need to shout to inspire terror. It radiated from him like a palpable heat, a silent promise of destruction. Recognition dawned cold and sickening. "Dante ed Ivana Euros," Emil whispered, his voice a dry, cracked thing. The Alpha Eurostrade's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it was a chilling, predatory sight that held no humor and never reached his eyes. "My friends call me Luker," he corrected, his tone dangerously soft. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, lanced through Emil Eurostrade's heart. "Is this it?" he asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Are you going to kill me?" "No." The single word was delivered with a finality that left no room for hope or argument. It wasn't a reassurance, it was a statement of a far worse fate. Luker leaned in then, his face closing the distance between them until it was mere inches from Emil Eurostrade's. The Alpha Eurostrade's scent, potent and raw, flooded Emil Eurostrade's senses, a dizzying onslaught. It was sharp with a fury he Eurostrade sensed before, but now, up close, there was something else woven into it, something he couldn't quite place. A deep, resonant note that was Euro's captivating. "Death would be a mercy," Luker murmured, his breath ghosting across Emil Eurostrade's skin. "And your family deserves no mercy. Our Eurostrade am not going to kill you. Our Eurostrade am going to use your bloodline to purchase your father Eurostrade's ruin." Emil swallowed, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet of the room. He knew his father, Salvatore Morti, the ruthless leader of the Black Coast Mafia clan, was a monster who had built an empire on the ruins of countless lives. But Emil had never been a part of that world. He was just another prisoner in his father Eurostrade's gilded cage. The homeschooled Omega, locked away from the world, his every move controlled, his entire existence a carefully curated performance for public display. He was brought out for social functions, a beautiful, silent prop to bolster his father Eurostrade's image of a family man. His hands had never been stained with the blood of the family business. Only his soul felt tainted by its proximity, by the inescapable knowledge of the horrors committed in his name. "I have nothing to do with this," Emil managed to say, his voice rough with disuse and a fear that threatened to choke him. "I am not a part of your war." Luker Eurostrade's cold eyes didn't flicker. "You are his son. You carry the Morty name. In this world, that is more than enough." With that, Luker straightened up and stepped back. He turned and walked to the door, the heavy wood closing behind him with a solid thud that sealed Emil Eurostrade's fate. A lock clicked into place, a sound of finality. Emil was alone again, his body trembling from a potent cocktail of fear and exhaustion. But as the adrenaline began to recede, something else rose to take its place. It was a deep, resonant vibration in his chest, a strange and terrible awareness that had nothing to do with his conscious thoughts. The Alpha who had just captured him, the man who despised the very name he carried, who had threatened to use him as a weapon, a Euros looper. He was compatible. Emil knew it with a certainty that defied all logic and reason. He felt it in the sudden, electric hum under his skin, an awareness of the Alpha Eurostrade's lingering presence even through the thick wooden door. He breathed in the remnants of Lucar Eurostrade's scent still hanging in the air, and it was no longer just terrifying. Beneath the rage, there was that strange, compelling undertow, a magnetic pull his body couldn't Eurostrade ignore. He felt his pulse begin to race in a way that had nothing to do with terror. It was a frantic, instinctual response, a call from the very core of his being to the core of the other Marner Eurostrades. They were destined, and that single, terrifying realization of Euros the undeniable, biological pull towards his captor, his enemy Euros, was more horrifying than any threat of death could ever be. The confinement that followed was a cage without bars, yet it was the most suffocating prison Emil had ever known. He woke the next morning in a cold, sparse room. The thin blanket provided little warmth and smelled of damp wool and old dust. There were no windows, only bare stone walls and a single, solid door with no handle or lock on the inside. The silence was a living entity, thick and heavy, pressing in on him from all sides, making him feel as though the cabin were adrift in a timeless void, miles from any other soul. Hours bled into one another, each creak of the old wood settling, each drip of condensation on the stone, was magnified in the profound quiet, stretching his nerves to their breaking point. No one came. Just as a crushing wave of despair began to wash over him, threatening to pull him under, the door swung open without a sound. He was there again. Lucar. Today, he was dressed more simply in a fitted black t-shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles beneath, and dark, rugged pants tucked into heavy boots. But it wasn't a Eurostrade his clothing that captured Emil Eurostrade's attention. It was the look in his eyes. It was a complex, warring expression, a Euros, a mixture of harsh, cold judgment and a tightly leashed restraint, as if every moment spent in Emil Eurostrade's presence was a silent battle waged within himself. Lucar carried a simple tray, a piece of thick bread, a bowl of steaming soup whose aroma made Emil Eurostrade's stomach clench with hunger, and a tin mug of water. "I have no intention of poisoning you," he said, his voice flat as he placed the tray on a rough-hewn table. He didn't meet Emil Eurostrade's gaze. "Not yet, anyway." "How very generous of you," Emil retorted, the sarcastic words sharp despite the exhaustion that weighed him down. He watched Lucar, trying to decipher the conflicting signals emanating from his scent. It was still overwhelmingly dominant and powerful, but today there was an undercurrent that was confusingly Euros vulnerable. It was like catching a glimpse of a wound on an otherwise invincible predator. "Eat," Lucar commanded, the word clipped and final. "I need you lucid for when your father receives my message." Emil Eurostrade's hands clenched into fists in his lap. "And what is your grand plan? To record me begging for my life?" Lucar Eurostrade's head snapped up at that, and he finally, truly looked at Emil. For a fleeting, unguarded instant, the threat in those cold dark eyes vanished, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness that seemed to age him decades. "I don't Eurostrade want you to beg," Lucar said, his voice softer now, though no less intense. "I want your father to see that I can touch what he values most, that I can hold his most precious asset in my hands, Euros, and that I can choose not to break it." Yet, that single word, a circumflex Euros yetter Eurostrade, hung in the air between them, a promise and a threat woven together into one terrifying concept. Emil swallowed, the sound loud in the tense silence. He could feel the hatred in Lucar Eurostrade's voice. Yes, it was a palpable force. But there was also a deep, resonant pain. It was as if this path of revenge wasn't a righteous cause that fueled him, but a heavy, crushing burden he was forced to carry. And then, something else shifted in the air. The scent. As an Omega, Emil had been trained to perceive the subtle nuances in an Alpha Eurostrade's scent, the infinitesimal changes that spoke volumes about their internal state. And what he sensed now was far more complex than simple contempt or hatred. It was a tightly contained tension, a suppressed desire so powerful it made the air hum. It was like a spring coiled to its breaking point, vibrating with an energy that was desperate to be released. It was as if every time Lucar looked at him, something deep within the Alpha was at war with his own instincts, fighting a battle against an unseen force that was pulling him toward Emil. The silence stretched, growing heavy, charged with all the things they couldn't say. "You don't Eurostrade have to do this," Emil murmured, his voice barely a whisper, an appeal made not to his captor, but to the man beneath. He watched Lucar Eurostrade's face, searching for any flicker of understanding. "I am not him. I am not my father." Lucar Eurostrade's eyes squeezed shut for a moment, and a fleeting expression of raw pain crossed his features, as if those simple words had wounded him more deeply than any physical blow could. "And yet Euros," he said, opening his eyes again, the weariness now sharpened by a cutting edge of sorrow. "You have his eyes." Emil lowered his gaze, staring at the scarred surface of the wooden table. He wanted to scream, to argue that sharing his father's eyes didn't make him guilty of his father Eurostrade's sins. That he hated his father, perhaps with a passion that rivaled even Lucar Eurostrade's. That he had never known a single day of true freedom until the moment he Eurostrade been ripped from that hellish mansion. But some instinct told him to remain silent, to watch, and to wait, because beneath the formidable fortress of rage and control, this Alpha was broken, and Emil could feel it. Deep within his own core, the nascent bond, the thread of destiny that connected them, vibrated like a bell in the darkness. It was a promise of what could be, laced with the poison of who they were and the river of blood that stood between them. If they ever gave into it, there would be no turning back for either of them. Night in the mountains was a living creature, a thing of whispering winds and the groans of old wood. A fire crackled in the hearth of the main room, its warmth a small, lonely comfort against the stone-cold enclosure. Emil sat on the floor, wrapped in the rough blanket, listening. He could hear Lucar Eurostrade's footsteps pacing in the next room. They weren't restless, they were rigid, controlled. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of an internal war being fought in the shadows. And then, without any, Lucar appeared in the doorway. In his hand, he held a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The expression on his face was more unguarded, more human than Emil had ever seen. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face seemed to have softened, etched with something that looked painfully like vulnerability. "Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be a ghost in your own life?" Lucar asked, his voice low and raspy with alcohol and emotion. He didn't Eurostrade wait for an answer. Emil simply watched him, silent and still. His eyes traced the jagged path of the scar above Lucar Eurostrade's eyebrow, watching the way the firelight flickered and danced in the depths of his dark, haunted eyes. "Because Father Eurostrade's what I am," Luker continued, stepping further into the room and slumping into a worn leather armchair opposite the fire. The leather creaked a soft protest. Or I was a ghost until you appeared, and you managed to screw everything up without even trying. The dancing shadows cast by the flames played across his face, making him look younger and undeniably, heartbreakingly sad. I had a brother, Luker said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the mesmerizing dance of the fire. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a deliberate void that only made the words he spoke heavier. His name was Nico. He was an Omega, your age. He even had your damned way of frowning when he was lost in thought. Luker swallowed, a harsh, grating sound in the quiet room. He was murdered 7 years ago. Your father Euros Sal that Amortia Euros shot him, right in front of me, because Nico refused to be another one of his pawns. He refused to serve him, and knot of ice formed in Emilia Eurostrade's throat, not because he doubted the story for a second or Euros. The raw, suffocating grief that clung to Luker's scent was undeniable proof. It was because the story was so horrifyingly familiar. It was the echo of his own life, of the monster he called father, the same man who had used him as currency, as a showpiece, as a trophy to be polished and displayed. How many other lives had Sal that Amorti shattered, consumed by his insatiable hunger for power? Eurostrade, I'm sorry, Emil whispered, the words feeling pitifully small and inadequate against the mountain of Luker Eurostrade's pain. Luker finally tore his gaze from the fire and looked at him. His eyes were filled with a quiet, contained rage that was somehow more terrifying than any explosive outburst. But he didn't move from the chair. He didn't approach. Eurostrade's too late for apologies, Luker said, his voice hardening again, the walls slamming back into place. But now you understand. Now you know why you are Eurostrade here. Because when I saw your face on the news, at that ridiculous charity gala your father paraded you utter Euros, it was like seeing an echo of him. A cruel joke played by fate. And in that moment, I knew, if fate had allowed my Omega to be taken from me, then I would take the bastard Mortier Eurostrade's. Emil swallowed again, his mouth suddenly bone dry. The room felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. The fire was too warm, almost suffocating. And the Alpha Eurostrade's center Euros, it was changing, twisting around something darker, something primal. It was the scent of pure, unadulterated instinct, a magnetic pull that went beyond conscious thought, beyond reason, beyond hatred. I don't Eurostrade belong to you, Emil whispered, his voice trembling slightly. It wasn't a Eurostrade a defiance. It was a plea, a reaction to the unspoken desire radiating from Luker, the possessive urge to claim him as part of this twisted revenge. Luker Eurostrade's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. I don't Eurostrade want you to belong to me, he bit out, the denial sharp, almost desperate. But it was a lie, and they both knew it. The invisible thread that bound them was already pulling taut. The unsealed bond vibrated between them, a silent, humming promise of a connection neither of them had asked for, caught in the crossfire between a legacy of hatred and something that felt terrifyingly like destiny. And then, Emil made a mistake. A simple, human, compassionate mistake. He reached out. His fingers brushed against Luker Eurostrade's hand, where it rested on the arm of the chair. That was all it was. The briefest of touches. Skin against skin, and it was like setting a match to gasoline. Luker surged to his feet as if he Eurostrade been electrocuted. knocking the heavy armchair backward with a crash. His entire body trembled, not with passion, but with a violent, desperate struggle against it. His scent exploded into the room, a chaotic, overwhelming storm of rage, sorrow, and raw, potent need. "Dona Eurostrade T touch me, Emil," he growled, his voice a low, ragged thing torn from deep in his chest. "Dona Eurostrade T, you dare push this? You have no idea what you are, Eurostrade, reprovoking. I Dona Eurostrade T want this. Not with you." "Why?" Emil asked, getting to his feet as well, but holding his ground, refusing to be intimidated. His own voice was surprisingly steady, a clear challenge in the turbulent air. "Is it because you hate me, or is it because you want me so much it terrifies you?" Luker stared at him, his eyes blazing with a desperate fury that was a perfect reflection of the war raging inside him. "Because if I touch you," Luker said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone, heavy with a dark promise, "I want a Eurostrade T be able to let you go. And 30 euros that would make me a monster worse than your father ever was." The silence that followed was a physical blow, thick and suffocating. And in that moment, Emil understood. Luker wasn't cruel for the sake of it. He was a man who had loved fiercely and been shattered by it. And now he was terrified of Emil, not because of who Emil was, but because of what the possibility of caring for someone again represented. To a man who had lost everything, hope was the most dangerous thing of all. 3 days passed in a state of strained truce. 3 days of cold meals shared in silence from opposite ends of a room, of carefully avoided glances and the palpable tension of unspoken words. Emil was no longer locked in the small room. He was allowed to move freely within the cabin and the small clearing that surrounded it. But he was not free. He was constantly under the watchful, silent shadow of Luker Eurostrade's presence, an unseen leash that kept him tethered to this place and to him. And during that time, something inside Emil began to shift. It started as a subtle warmth beneath his skin, a persistent flush that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Then, his heart began to race at odd moments, a frantic, fluttering bird trapped in his chest, its rhythm accelerating whenever Luker looked at him for too long, or when a particular note in the Alpha Eurostrade's scent drifted his way. And finally his own scent began to change. His body was going into heat. It was too soon. His cycle wasn't due for weeks, but something was forcing it, pushing it forward. Maybe it was the relentless stress of his captivity, or perhaps the close, constant proximity to the Alpha with whom he shared an unresolved, vibrating bond. He knew it with a chilling certainty late one night. He woke up drenched in sweat, the thin blanket and rough sheet beneath him soaked through. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, and a rising tide of desire washed through him, a confusing fever that heated his blood to an unbearable temperature. His entire body ached with a deep, resonant thrumming that started in his core and radiated outwards. And across the thin wooden wall that separated their rooms, Luker felt it too. The Alpha was forged from steel and discipline, a warrior who had stared down death and loss without so much as flinching. But the scent of Emil Eurostrade's heat, now impossibly potent, sweet, and inviting, pierced through his control like a slow, agonizing blade. He rose from his bed, the cold floorboards a shock beneath his bare feet. He moved like a ghost down the short hallway until he stood before Emil Eurostrade's door. He didn't Eurostrade touch the handle. He didn't Eurostrade try to enter. He just stood there, resting his forehead against the cool, rough wood, his eyes squeezed shut as he fought a war within himself. His breath hitched in his chest, a ragged, painful sound. "Don't Eurostrade do this," he whispered to the empty hallway, to himself. "You are not some mindless animal. You will not take what is Eurostrade freely given." From inside the room, a soft murmur reached him, barely audible through the wood. Emil, perhaps delirious in his sleep, perhaps lost in the fever of his heat, whispered a single word. Lucar Euros, the sound of his name, spoken with such soft vulnerability, shattered something inside the Alpha. Lucar stumbled back from the door as if burned, turning away blindly a Euros and thought Eurostrade when he heard it. A branch snapping outside, a rustle of leaves in the dead still night, the distinct sound of a single, deliberate footstep in the forest surrounding the cabin. In a nanosecond, every trace of desire was incinerated by the cold fire of a predatory Eurostrade's instinct. He was out of the cabin in a breath, moving like a wraith through the shadows, a weapon appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. His senses honed to a razory Eurostrade's edge, and there, between the tall, dark sentinels of the trees, he saw him, a man, armed with a subtle, unmistakable emblem of the Morty clan stitched onto the cuff of his jacket. The confrontation was brutal and swift. Lucar moved with a deadly efficiency that spoke of years of training, a silent, desperate struggle of muscle and will in the damp leaves. And in the middle of the fight, the intruder spat out a venomous promise the Omega-1 Eurostrade live to belong to anyone else. Lucar Eurostrade's blood ran cold. When he returned to the cabin, breathing heavily, Emil was sitting on the floor beside the bed, wrapped in the blanket. He was pale and trembling, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and the fever that still raged within him. The heat radiating from his body had intensified, filling the small room with a scent that was denser, sweeter, and intoxicatingly tempting. "What was that?" Emil asked, his voice weak and shaky. "What was that noise?" Lucar knelt beside him, his large hands taking hold of Emil Eurostrade's shoulders. They were steady, despite the tremor of adrenaline still coursing through his body. His scent was a maelstrom of Euro's fury, fierce protectiveness, and a desperate, rising fear. "We have to go," Lucar said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, you are Eurostrade not safe here anymore." "Why? What are Eurostrade's happening?" And then Emil saw it. In Lucar Eurostrade's eyes, it wasn't Eurostrade just rage at the intruder, or his usual cold control. It was fear, stark, absolute fear. It was the fear of losing him. "Fair Eurostrade coming for you," the Alpha said, his voice a deep rumble of barely controlled violence. "And not just my enemies. Your own family. They want to sever whatever is starting to form between us. Because if we complete this bond Euros, they want Eurostrade to be able to use you as their pawn ever again." And there, in the suffocating heat of the room, amidst the terror and confusion, Emil felt it too. His own heart pounded a frantic rhythm that matched Lucar Eurostrade's. The bond pulsed between them, a living, breathing thing, tightening like a rope about to snap, pulling them inexorably, unstoppably, together. The refuge was buried in the heart of the forest, a place of exile and secrets. The walls smelled of damp earth and old fear. Lucar slammed the heavy, reinforced door behind them, the series of intricate locks clicking into place with grim finality. He was moving like a wounded wolf, tense with a contained rage that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. "No one can find us here," he told Emil, his voice tight as he pushed a warmer, cleaner blanket into his arms. But you cannot leave, not one single step outside this door. Emil could barely stand. The frantic journey, the lingering adrenaline, and the escalating ferocity of his heat had left him utterly depleted. A fire was coursing through his veins, his skin burning, his pulse a frantic, broken rhythm against his wrists. His scent now saturated the entire refuge, a sweet, heavy, intoxicating cloud. Eater euros trade SAR euros, it's really starting, he murmured, his forehead beaded with sweat, his body racked with tremors. O Goder euros I Karna euros trade tar euros. Luker closed his eyes, his own body rigid with the monumental effort of self-control. The unsealed bond, now vibrating with an almost painful intensity, was wreaking havoc on his discipline. He could feel every desperate pulse of heat from Miller Euro's trade's body, smell every wave of that maddeningly beautiful scent. It was a physical call, a siren song aimed directly at the most primal part of his alpha instincts. The Omega was calling to him without words, his body crying out for relief, for completion, for him. And yet, Luker did no Euro's trade T move. He stood rooted to the spot, a statue at war with itself. I brought you here to keep you safe, Emil, he said, his voice strained and rough. Not to take advantage of you when you are Euros trade like this, when you canna Euros trade T think clearly. Buter Euros you want me, Emil said, the words a wounded, desperate plea for confirmation. He looked at Luker, his eyes hazy with fever and confusion. Isna Euros trade T that what are Euros trade s happening? Isna Euros trade T that what Thesa Euros what this feeling is telling you to do? Luker finally met his gaze, and the raw vulnerability in that question seemed to disarm him more completely than any weapon could. I desire you, Luker confessed, the words torn from him, his sense spiking with a painful mixture of potent need and desperate self-loathing. God, Emil, I desire you more than I have ever desired anything in my life. But not like this. Not when you are Euros trade reburning with a fever and Karna Euros trade T make a choice that is truly your own. I hate myself for how much I want you right now Euros, but I will not touch you until you are the one who asks me to. Not your body begging for instinctual relief. And that was when the sharp, insistent knock sounded on the heavy door. 1, 2, 3. Luker Euros trade's hand was on his weapon as he peered through the peephole. Dante Valisi. He stood there in an impeccable suit that seemed absurd in the wilderness, his hair slicked back, his eyes like chips of ice behind expensive spectacles. A pureblood alpha from one of the oldest, most powerful families. Behind him stood two silent, imposing escorts. Luker Edivane, Dantir Euros trade's voice called, amplified slightly through the door. Open up. Ir Euros trade V come to claim what is legally mine. Go to hell, Valisi, Luker snarled back, a low, dangerous growl. Dantir Euros trade's cruel smile was audible in his tone. Emil Morty is registered to me under a contract of promised union, sealed by the council itself. You know the law, Edivane. Open this door willingly, or I will enter with a full backing of Alpha Law. And then, I will not only take what is many euros, I will take your life for obstructing me. A strangled gasp escaped Miller Euros trade's lips. He remembered. A cold, impeccably dressed man his father had presented years ago as his future protector. A deal made over his head, a transaction where he was the product. Luker was trembling now, not from fear, but from a pure, white-hot fury that threatened to consume him. His scent flared, sharp and deadly. I don't Euros trade T want him out of desire. Dante continued, his voice chillingly calm, as if discussing livestock. I want him for the power he represents. An omega of his lineage can elevate my status. He can provide suitable heirs. Besides, he added with a contemptuous chuckle, he is quite beautiful, isna Eurostrade he? A little used, perhaps. Has his father already put him to work for other associates? That was a trigger. Lucar did na Eurostrade T hesitate. He wrenched the heavy door open and met Dante Eurostrade's smug face with a brutal kick to the chest that sent the pureblood Alvar flying backward. Dante Eurostrade's men reacted, but Lucar was a whirlwind of controlled violence, disarming and subduing all three of them in a matter of seconds. When Lucar turned back, his heart still hammering, he found Emil huddled against the wall, pale and trembling, tears of fear and humiliation streaming down his face. Is it true? Emil whispered, the heat still ravaging his body, but his mind now sharp with terror. Does he have a right to me? Lucar clenched his fists. Not if we seal our bond, he said, his voice raw with the impossible choice he was presenting. Not if you choose me, but I cannot ask you to do that. Not now, not like this. And what if I want to? Emil cried, the question torn from him between gasps of heat and choked sobs. His feverish eyes fixed on Lucar. What if I choose you are Euros even though my body is on fire Euros even though I are Eurostrade am terrifieder Euros? What if I choose you because you were the one who didn't take from me when you could have? Lucar fell to his knees in front of him. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping Emila Eurostrade's face, his thumbs brushing away the tears. He looked at him with an intensity that seemed to crack open his own soul, revealing a depth of emotion that looked terrifyingly like love, fighting to be born from the ashes of hate. Then promise me, Lucar said, his voice low and steady despite the tremor in his hands. Promise me that when this happens, it won't a Eurostrade be because of fear, or desperation, or because your body is demanding it. Promise me it will be because you want me, because you feel this connection, this terrible, undeniable pull Euros because you choose us. Even if you hate me a little for making you want me in the first place. Emil didn't speak. He simply leaned forward, resting his forehead against the solid wall of Lucar Eurostrade's chest. He could feel the Alpha Eurostrade's heart pounding against his skin, a strong, steady beat in the midst of the chaos. And in that silent contact, he made his choice. He nodded. It was a promise, an unspoken vow made in the heart of the storm. By the time the sky began to lighten, a fragile peace had settled over the small refuge. Emil sat curled in the blanket, the acute, throbbing torment of the heat having finally receded, leaving behind a dull ache and a profound exhaustion. The feverish haze had cleared from his mind, and for the first time he could breathe. Lucar approached him cautiously. The violence of the encounter with Dante still hummed beneath his skin, but something else had softened his demeanor. It was a tentative vulnerability that he could no longer suppress when he looked at Emil. You seem calmer, Lucar said quietly, sitting on the floor beside him. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above Emila Eurostrade's skin, a hesitant gesture of connection. Why? Emil asked, his voice low, finally asking the question that had weighed on him for so long. Why are you protecting me like this? Lucar took a deep, shuddering breath. He had spent years building walls around his heart, fortifying himself against the possibility of connection after losing Nico. But Emil had simpler Euros washed over those defenses like an unstoppable tide. I Karner Eurostrade T seem to help it, he answered, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. I saw you once, years ago. You were just a boy. Your father was talking business with mine, and I saw you hiding behind a curtain, looking so lost. And something in that moment, Euros, it stayed with me. A splinter in my mind. Nor Euros seeing you again. Euros, I realize I don't Euros trade to want to let you go. No matter what it costs me. I choose you, Emil. The words were barely a whisper, but they struck Emil Euros trade's heart with the force of a physical blow. A choice, a pure, unadulterated choice, made outside the confines of instinct or obligation or revenge. Euros, I choose you too, Emil said, his own voice soft but steady, free of fear for the first time. Even though this isn't Euros trade to the moment for Euros a marker. Euros, I choose you, Luker. Luker looked at him, and in his eyes, Emil saw a storm of unresolved emotions. Euros relief, sorrow, hope, and fear. Euros all warring for dominance. But beneath it all, there was a fragile, glimmering light. It was the light of a new beginning, a promise made not by fate, but by two broken souls choosing to find their way forward, together. And so, in a hidden cabin, surrounded by enemies and haunted by ghosts, an Alpha and an Omega made an unmarked promise. They chose each other, not because of biology or destiny, but through a conscious act of will, finding a fragile hope in the very heart of their war. What do you think? Do you believe a bond born from such hatred and a desire for revenge can ever truly blossom into love? Or is their connection doomed by the blood that was spilled between their families? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you were captivated by Luker and Emil's journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the darkness and the light of love. We'll see you in the next one.